Hi there, Year 5 and 6, Mr. A here with Story Time, and we're going to start Chapter 4 of Susan Cooper's Oversea Under Stone. And if you remember from the end, the Drew children have just been promised a little day voyage on the Withers yacht. No relation to Bill, I wonder. Anyway, so here's Chapter 4. A white morning haze lay over the sea, and down in the harbour the boats shifted idly on still water, bright under the sun. Jane peered down from her window. The fishing boats were deserted, but she could see two small figures clambering from a dinghy beside the quay. Simon said behind her, "I brought this for you to look after, if you really aren't coming." She turned and saw him holding out a grey woolen sock. It looked peculiarly stiff and cylindrical. "What on earth's so special about your socks?" Simon grinned but lowered his voice. "It's the manuscript. I couldn't think of anything else to put it in." Jane laughed, took the sock and pulled the manuscript out halfway. But even though she handled it gently, the edges cracked and crumbled ominously as they caught in the wool. "Hey," she said, alarmed. "If that's going to happen every time, the whole thing'll fall to bits in a week. It was all right up in the attic, lying there for years without anyone touching it. But if we're going to carry it around..." Simon looked anxiously at the curled parchment, its battered edges dark with age, and saw cracks that had not been there before. He said, troubled, "But we'll have to handle it so much if we're going to find out what it means. Wait a minute, though. That room..." Leaving Jane baffled, he seized the manuscript and ran downstairs to the small dark door on the first floor landing which led to the passage they had discovered on the way to the attic. It was still unlocked. He stepped down into the tiny passage and across to the bare, austere room that they had decided was the captain's bedroom. It was just as it had been the day before, and the telescope case was still lying on the windowsill. Simon picked up the case and unscrewed it. The thread of each half was bright and untarnished, shining with a faint film of oil, and the copper lining inside, when he held it up to the light, glinted dry and clean. He dropped the rolled manuscript inside. It fitted perfectly, resting snugly between the two halves when he screwed them together again. Simon looked thoughtfully around the room, as if it might tell him something, but there was nothing but the silence and the mysterious lived-in emptiness, and he closed the door again, gently, and ran back upstairs. "Look," he said to Jane, "might have been made for it." "Perhaps it was," said Jane, taking the case. "You'd better hide it somewhere," said Simon. "What about the top of our wardrobe?" "I'll think of a good place," said Jane thoughtfully. But Simon, halfway back to his own room already, hardly heard her. Already his mind was racing ahead to the day on the Withers' yacht, and by the time he, Barney and father were gone, in a great scuffle of argument over oilskins and pullovers and bathing trunks, Jane was almost beginning to wish she had changed her mind and gone too. But she said firmly, to Simon's final jeers, "No, I'd only spoil it all if I got sick." And instead she stood watching from the window as they ran down to the quay, and the little dinghy bobbed out to the tall, slim, white yacht. Her mother, easel under one arm and a bag of sandwiches and paints in the other hand, looked at her doubtfully. "Darling, are you sure you aren't going to be lonely?" "Goodness no," said Jane stoutly. "I shall just wander about. It'll be fun. Honestly, I mean, you don't get lonely when you're painting, do you?" Mother laughed. "All right, Independence, you wander. Don't get lost. I shall be up above the harbour on the other side if you want me. Mrs. Polk's going to be here all day. She'll get you lunch. Why don't you take Rufus for a walk?" She went out into the sunshine, her eyes already vague with the shape and colour of her painting. Jane felt a wet nose pushed her hand, looked down at Rufus's large, hopeful brown eyes, laughed, and ran off with him down the village, through the strange small streets, and the Cornish voices lilting from the doorways of the shops. But all the morning she felt curiously restless, as if something were jostling to push itself to the front of her mind, as if she thought her mind were trying to say something to her that she couldn't quite hear. When she brought Rufus home to collapse in a panting and heap in the kitchen beside Mrs. Polk, she was still thoughtful and subdued. "Nice walk, lovey," said Mrs. Polk, sitting back on her heels. She had a bucket of soapy water beside her, and her face was red and shiny. She had been scrubbing the grey slate floor. Jane said vaguely. She fiddled with the bow on her ponytail. "Have his lunch ready in a minute," Mrs. Polk said, scrambling to her feet. "My, just look at that dog. Proper wore out." Needs a drink of water, I'll be bound. She reached for Rufus's dish. I'll go up and wash, Jane wandered out through the hall, the cool, dark passage with the sunlight shafting in on one of the old maps that Polly Withers had exclaimed over with such delight. Miss Withers. Why should she and her brother have seemed sinister? They were perfectly ordinary people. There was no real reason to think otherwise. It was kind of them to have asked everyone out for the day on the yacht. Odd, though, that remark she had made about exploring and finding things. Finding things. Halfway up the stairs, Jane remembered with a sudden shock of guilt that she had left the manuscript alone all the morning, shut in its new case in the drawer of her bedside table. Should she have taken it with her? No, don't be silly, she thought. But she scuttled up the stairs and into her room anxiously, and felt a surge of relief as she saw the case lying quietly glinting in the drawer. She drew out the brown roll of parchment and took it to the window, gingerly straightening it out. The lines of cramped black lettering gave her the same shiver of uneasy excitement that she had felt in the attic at that moment when suddenly they had all three realised what they were looking at. She peered at it, but the squat chunks of words were no more legible now than they had been then. She could just make out the initials of the words that Simon had said were Mark and Arthur. How were they ever to find out what it all meant? She looked down at the bottom of the curling sheet, at the few thin, wavering lines that they had thought might be a map. In the dim light of the attic there had been little there to see, but now Jane had the full white glare of midday. She bent closer, suddenly realising that there were more lines in the map than she had noticed at first, lines so faint that before she had mistaken them for cracks, and among them, fainter still, some words were written. It was a very rough map, as if it had been hurriedly drawn. It seemed to be coastline, looking rather like a letter W lying on its side, with two inlets and a headland. Or was it two headlands and an inlet? There was no way of telling which side was supposed to be the sea, and although she could just see that there was a word written across one of the projecting arms of land, or sea, it was made totally unreadable by one of the breaks in the ancient crumbling parchment, a crack crossing the word out as neatly as if it had been a thick ink line. Bother, said Jane crossly aloud. She realised as she said it that she had become determined in the last half-minute to have some discovery of her own about the manuscript to announce to Simon and Barney when they came back from their day on the boat. That was what had been niggling at the back of her mind all morning. One other name was written across the map, if it was a name. The letters were small and brown, but more distinct than those on the rest of the manuscript. Jane worked them out one by one and found they made 3 words. Ring, mark, heed. She stared, disappointed. It meant nothing. Ring, mark, heed. It wasn't even a place. How could a place have a name like that? The clang of the ship's bell in the hall came echoing up the stairs, breaking into the stillness of the sea's murmur and the distant gulls, and she heard Mrs. Polk calling faintly below, Jane! Jane! Hastily she rolled up the manuscript and dropped it back into the telescope case, screwing the 2 halves tight together. She opened the drawer of her bedside table, hesitated for a moment, then shut it again. Better not to let it out of her sight. She snatched a cardigan from the bed, wrapped it round the case, and ran out and down the stairs 2 at a time. But she ran too fast. Swinging round a corner of the first-floor landing, she bumped heavily against a long, low wooden chest lying in the shadows, and yelped with pain. It would have to be the same leg she had hurt down on the quay, but as she bent to rub her knee, something drew her attention away. The chest she had knocked against was the one they had noticed the day before, with the lid locked. Native gold and ornaments, Simon had said, and then found he couldn't open it. But now the lid had sprung open a few inches, and was rocking gently up and down. It must have been stuck, not locked, and her collision had jerked it loose. Curiously, Jane lifted it fully open. There was not much inside. Some old newspapers, a big pair of leather gloves, 2 or 3 heavy woolen sweaters, and half hidden a small black-covered book. A very dull treasure, she thought. The book might be interesting. She reached down inside and picked it up. Jane! Mrs. Polk's voice was nearer, coming up the stairs. Guiltily, Jane dropped the lid and bundled the little book inside the folds of her cardigan with the telescope case. Mrs. Polk's face puffed into view through the banisters. Coming, Jane said meekly. "Ah, there, thought he'd gone to bed. Getting too fat for the stairs, I am." Mrs. Polk beamed at her. "Lunch is on the table. I were taking my pastry out of the oven, or I'd not have kept ye so long." She waddled back to the kitchen. A mounded plateful of ham and salad waited for Jane in the dining room, like a small bright island in the glossy sea of the polished mahogany table. Beside it was a dish of gooseberry tart and a small jug of cream. Jane sat down and ate everything absently, leafing with one hand through the little book she had found in the chest. It was a guidebook to the village, written by a local vicar. "A Short Guide to Trewhisk," said the title page in flowing curly type, "compiled by the Reverend E.J. Hawes Mellor, M.A. Oxon, vicar of the parish church of St. John, Trewhisk." Not exciting, thought Jane, her interest dying. She flipped through the narrow pages, full of details of rambles through the countryside around. The words from the manuscript were still swimming before her mind. If only she could have something to tell Simon and Barney about the map. It was then that the guidebook fell open at its centre page, under her fingers. Jane glanced down idly, then paused. The page showed a detailed map of Trewhisk village, with every street, straight and winding, patterned behind the harbour that lay snug in between two headlands. The churches, the village hall, were all separately marked. She saw with a quick thrill of pride that the grey house was marked by name, on the road that led up to the tip of Kimare Head, and then faded into nothing. But what caught her attention was the name written neatly across the headland. It read, King Mark's Head. "King Mark's Head," said Jane slowly aloud. She reached down to the bundled cardigan lying beside her chair, drew out the telescope case and unrolled the manuscript on the table. The words stared up at her, cramped and enigmatic. "Ring Mark Heed." And as she looked, she saw that first letter of the first word, blurred with age and dirt, might very well not be an R but a K. She gulped with excitement and took a deep breath. King Mark's Head, the same name on both maps. So that the map on the manuscript from the attic must be a map of Trewhisk, of that very part of Trewhisk on which the grey house stood. The strange words must be an old name for Kimare Head. But when the first delighted shock had washed over her, she looked again from one map to the other, and her spirits sank a little. There was something very odd about the wavering outline of the coast drawn on the old manuscript, something more than the inaccuracies you find in a rough freehand drawing. The lines of the coast were not the same as those on the guidebook map. The headlands bulged strangely, and the harbour was the wrong shape. Why? Puzzled, Jane fetched a stub of pencil from the sideboard and did her best to draw a faint copy of the manuscript coastline over the one on the guidebook. There was no doubt about it. The shapes were not the same. Perhaps the manuscript didn't show Trewhisk after all. Perhaps there were two headlands in Cornwall called King Mark's Head. Or perhaps the coast had changed its shape in the hundreds of years since the manuscript had been drawn. How on earth were they to find out? She put the manuscript reluctantly away and stared at the two outlines, one in print, one in pencil, and she now had on the page of the book. But still she could find no answer. In exasperation she flipped back the pages of the book and suddenly caught sight of the title page again. The Reverend E.J. Hawes Mellor, M.A. Jane jumped to her feet. That was it! Why not? The Vicar of Trewhisk must know all about the district. He was the expert. He had written the guidebook. He would know whether the coast had changed its shape and what it had been like before. That was the way to find out. The only way. He was the only person who wouldn't ask why she wanted to know. He would think she was just interested in his book. She must go and find him and ask. And then think how she would have to tell Simon and Barney when they came home. That was the final thought which decided Jane. Normally the way she would spend her afternoon. She turned quickly as the door opened and Mrs. Polk came rolling in. Finished, Abby? Enjoy it? Lovely, thank you very much. Jane gathered up the guidebook and the precious woolly bundle of her cardigan. Mrs. Polk, she said tentatively, do you know the Vicar of Trewhisk? Surely, she thought with all those hymns. Well, not myself personally, no. Mrs. Polk became very grave and solemn. Being chapel, I don't have no contact with him, though I see it about, of course. Trouble clever man, they do say the vicar is. Was he thinking of taking a look at the church, my dear? Yes, Jane said. After all, I probably shall, she added defensively to herself. All right, be back again tomorrow with part 2 of chapter 4.